Francis Drake came home to England in September 1580 as the richest sailor in the country, and the first thing his queen did was order him to keep his mouth shut about where he had been. Not asked, ordered. His logbooks were taken from him, his charts were taken, his maps were taken, and every surviving man of his crew was told that if he described the route they had sailed, the punishment was death. So let us start with what that ship was actually carrying, because it makes the silence stranger, not less strange. Plymouth Harbour, the 26th of September, 1580. One ship comes in, so worm-eaten and so heavily loaded that she's sitting low in the water, and half the town does not recognise her, because half the town gave her up for dead 2 years ago. She's been gone for 1,018 days. In her hold is the largest quantity of stolen property ever carried into England on a single keel. 26 tons of silver, 80 pounds of gold, 13 chests of coins, a crucifix of solid gold, jewels that nobody ever bothered to write down properly. When Elizabeth I, Queen of England, takes her share of that cargo, she pays off the entire debt of the English government. Every penny the Crown owes to every lender in Europe, cleared. And she still has £40,000 sitting on the table afterwards, which she puts into founding a new trading company. The men who invested in this voyage get £47 back for every single pound they put in. Drake is knighted on the deck of his own ship, and the order stands. Say nothing. Sit with the shape of that for a second, because it does not fit together. A man comes home with a fortune, a knighthood, and the personal gratitude of his queen, and the instruction he receives is silence. Now, part of the answer is sitting right there in plain sight. The silver was stolen. All of it. Taken from Spanish ships and Spanish ports, at a moment when England and Spain were technically at peace, which means Elizabeth has just personally profited from an act of piracy on a scale that could start a war. Of course, she does not want it discussed, but that explains hiding the money. It does not explain hiding the map, because somewhere inside those 3 years there is a gap. In the summer of 1579, half a planet away from anyone who could check on him, Drake's ship turns north and runs up a coastline no European vessel had ever seen, and then the record goes thin. The accounts that survive were written after the silence order was already in place. The latitudes in them do not agree with each other. 2 of the earliest published versions of this voyage contradict one another about how far north he went, and by a distance you could fit a country into. So here is the question. I am going to hang over the whole night, and not close until the end, because 4.5 centuries of professional historians have not closed it either. Where did Francis Drake actually go in the summer of 1579? These serious proposals run from a beach a little north of San Francisco, to Oregon, to Vancouver Island, to the coast of Alaska, and they are not all cranks. Some of them come from people who have spent decades inside the maps. Nobody has proved it. There is no wreck, no monument, no surviving log in his own hand. There is a hole in the record exactly where the most interesting part of the story should be, and the hole was put there deliberately by a government on purpose. Somebody wanted this forgotten. It nearly worked. If you're here to relax, you're in exactly the right place. So get comfortable and let the story carry you for a while. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I love knowing that someone might be listening over breakfast in Manchester, while someone else is lying awake in Denver at 2 in the morning. All of us, in completely different places, stepping into the same story together. And let's go back to 1579. because that is where we are going, onto that ship, from the first morning. And I want to be straight with you about what kind of man we are following, because Drake gets sold 2 different ways depending on who is doing the selling. In England, for 4 centuries, he was the hero, the sea dog, the man who helped break the Spanish Armada, the boy from Devon who took on the largest empire on earth and won. In Spain, he was El Drac, the dragon, a thief with a royal license. Mothers used his name to frighten children with for generations. So here is the route we take tonight. 5 ships leaving Plymouth in December 1577 under sealed orders, with a crew who've been told they're sailing to Egypt. A trial held on an empty beach at the bottom of the world, ending with a man's head on the sand. A man who'd been Drake's friend. A strait that took Magellan 38 days to get through, and took Drake 16. An ocean where no English ship had ever been, lined with Spanish towns that had never in their lives needed a wall. The single richest robbery ever committed at sea, which took 6 days just to move the cargo across. A summer that vanished out of the record. A landing somewhere on the coast of North America, and a piece of engraved brass that fooled the United States for 40 years before anybody thought to test it. And, at the far end, 1 ship out of 5 coming home the long way round the planet, with 56 men left alive out of 164. We're going to start in a room in London, with a man standing in front of Elizabeth being told something so dangerous that she refused to let it be written down. Francis Drake was not born into any of this. And I want you to hold one thing in your head while we go back, because it is the engine of everything he does. Every single decision this man makes over 3 years is downstream of one afternoon, 12 years earlier, when the Spanish gave him their word in writing and then opened fire. He came out of Devon, in the far southwest of England, into a family with no money and no name. His father was a farm worker who became a preacher, a Protestant, at a moment when being a Protestant in England could get your house burned down depending on which way the crown was leaning that decade. And at some point in Drake's childhood the family had to run. They ended up living in a hulk, a decommissioned ship beached and rotting, converted into a house on the Medway estuary in Kent. He was apprenticed young to the master of a small coastal trader, running cargo up and down the channel. It is about as unglamorous as sailing gets. Short hops, bad weather, sandbanks everywhere. But it produced a very particular kind of sailor, one who learned to read water rather than instruments, because in that trade there was nothing else to read. The old master left him the boat when he died, so by his early 20s Drake owned a ship and had spent his whole life in the most technically demanding water in Europe. Then he went to sea properly with his cousin, and here we hit the stretch of all this that is genuinely ugly, and I am going to say it plainly and once, because leaving it out would be dishonest, and dwelling on it would be a different video. Drake's cousin was John Hawkins, and in the 1560s Hawkins ran the first English slaving voyages, sailing to West Africa, taking people by force and by trade, carrying them across the Atlantic and selling them in Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Drake sailed on those voyages as a young man. He was a junior figure, not the architect, but he was there, and he profited from it. Those voyages were the beginning of an English trade that would go on for another 2.5 centuries and destroy an incalculable number of lives. In September 1568, Hawkins's fleet was caught by bad weather and put into a harbour on the Mexican coast called San Juan de Ulua, at what is now Veracruz. They needed to repair. Whilst they were there, a Spanish fleet arrived. The 2 sides negotiated. Hostages were exchanged, formal guarantees were given on both sides in writing, and then the Spanish attacked. It was an ambush and it worked. Almost every English ship in that harbour was destroyed or taken. Hundreds of men were killed or captured, and a number of the prisoners ended up in the hands of the Inquisition. 2 ships got out. One was Hawkins's, the other was a small vessel called the Judith, commanded by a 28-year-old Francis Drake, who sailed away in the night and left the rest of them. Hawkins never entirely forgave him for it. But what Drake took away from San Juan de Ulua was simpler and harder. The Spanish had given their word and broken it, and men he knew had died for it. From that day forward, for the next 28 years, until the last hour of his life, Drake operated on a single organizing principle: Spain owes me, and he intended to collect personally. Through the early 1570s, he went back to the Caribbean again and again, on small voyages with tiny crews, raiding the Spanish supply chain, and in 1572 he did something on the Isthmus of Panama that would decide the shape of the rest of his life. The Spanish silver system worked like this. Silver came out of the mountains of Peru, mostly out of one catastrophic mountain at Potosi, and was shipped north to Panama. Then it was loaded onto mule trains and walked across the isthmus, 60 or so kilometres of jungle, to the Caribbean side and onto the treasure fleets for Spain. That mule road was the narrowest point in the entire wealth of the Spanish Empire. Everything went through it. Drake went for the mule trains. His first attempt was a fiasco. One of his men had been drinking and gave them away, and the ambush collapsed. But while he was in those hills, guided by cimarrones, communities of people who had escaped Spanish enslavement and were living free in the interior, and who had every reason on earth to help anybody attacking Spain, one of them took him up a tall tree on a ridge. They had built steps into it. From the top, on a clear day, you could see both oceans at once. Drake climbed it, and on one side of him was the Atlantic, which he knew, and on the other side of him was the Pacific, which no Englishman had ever sailed on. It was Spanish water. Entirely, exclusively, unquestionably Spanish water, and it had been for 50 years. According to the account, he got down out of that tree and prayed aloud in front of witnesses that God would give him life and leave to sail an English ship on that sea. He was 32. He had no money, no ship capable of it, no route, and no permission. 5 years later, he had all 4. What changed was politics. By 1577, the relationship between England and Spain had gone from cold to something worse. Philip II of Spain was the most powerful monarch in Europe, ruling Spain, Portugal's rival empire, half of Italy, the Netherlands, and the entire American silver supply. Elizabeth was running a small, poor, isolated Protestant kingdom on the edge of the map, with a treasury that had been in deficit for most of her reign, no standing army worth the name, and a very real possibility that Philip would eventually decide to remove her. She could not fight him. She could not afford to, but she could quietly fund a man to go and steal from him at a distance and deny all of it. The plan came together in London in 1577 among a small group: Walsingham, her spymaster, the Earl of Leicester, the Lord High Admiral, Sir Christopher Hatton, and in the background John Dee, mathematician, astrologer, geographer, owner of the largest private library in England, and the man arguing hardest that England had a legal right to the northern parts of America. Drake was brought in to see the Queen. We have no transcript, only Drake's own later account of what she said, reported second-hand, that she would gladly be revenged on the King of Spain for injuries she had received. And then the crucial part. The written commission Drake was given described a trading and exploring voyage. It said nothing about raiding Spanish ships or sacking Spanish ports. That instruction was given verbally, deliberately, because if it existed on paper, and the paper was ever produced in front of a Spanish ambassador, it was an act of war with the Queen's signature on it. According to Drake, Elizabeth also told him that none of her ministers must know the real purpose. She specifically named the Lord Treasurer, William Cecil, as a man who must not be told because he was the leader of the faction that wanted peace with Spain. So look at the position Drake is now in. He has been given a mission by his monarch. The mission is illegal. The only proof he has that it was authorized at all is a conversation with no witnesses. If it succeeds, he is a hero. If it fails, or if it becomes politically inconvenient, the Queen can deny the entire thing, and he is a pirate, and pirates in Elizabethan England were hanged in chains at low water mark and left there until 3 tides had washed over them. He said yes, and the secrecy did not stop at the ministers. It went all the way down to the deck. The crew were recruited on the understanding that they were sailing to Alexandria, in Egypt, to trade for currants. Currants, that was the cover story. A boring Mediterranean cargo run. 164 men signed on for a trip to Egypt. Not one of them, apart from a tiny handful of officers, had the faintest idea where they were actually going. And they were not going to find out for another 6 months. They sailed on the 15th of November 1577, and a storm off the Cornish coast broke the masts of 2 ships within a day and drove the whole fleet back into harbour. They unloaded, repaired, and started again. The real departure was the 13th of December. Here is what went out. The Pelican, Drake's flagship, about 100 tons. The Elizabeth, 80 tons, commanded by John Winter. The Marigold, 30 tons. The Swan, 50. The Benedict, 15. Those numbers mean nothing until you convert them. The Pelican was about 21 metres long on deck, 70 feet. She carried 18 guns and 80 men. Go and stand next to a bus. Now imagine that bus holding 80 people, their food for a year, their drink and water, 18 cannon and the powder for them, spare sails, spare rope, spare timber, tools, trade goods, livestock, and a hold deep enough to eventually take 26 tons of stolen silver. Then imagine that bus going round the planet. The others were smaller. The Benedict was 15 tons. That is a fishing boat. Below decks on the Pelican, an adult man couldn't stand upright. Men slept on the deck, on chests, on coils of rope, in whatever space they could hold. The bilge at the very bottom, where the water that got in collected could never be fully emptied, and its smell got into everything, and everybody stopped noticing it after about a week, which is its own kind of horror. And crucially, there were 2 kinds of people on board. There were the mariners, professional sailors, mostly poor, mostly from the West Country, who did the work. And there were the gentlemen, men of good family who had invested in the voyage or been placed on it by patrons, who were aboard as officers or advisors or ornaments, and who did not haul rope. That division was completely normal in 1577. It was also, as we're about to see, the fuse on the whole thing. Because among the gentlemen was a man named Thomas Doughty. Doughty was everything Drake was not. Educated, a lawyer, a courtier, secretary to Sir Christopher Hatton, one of the financiers of this voyage and one of the Queen's closest favourites. He had connections at the top of English society that a farm worker's son from Devon could not dream of. He and Drake had met in Ireland the year before on campaign and become friends, genuine friends, as far as anyone can tell. Doughty had also helped get this voyage approved. He had lobbied for it. Some accounts say he believed he was sailing as joint commander, an equal. Drake did not believe that for 1 second. Keep Doughty in your mind from here to the bottom of the world, because everything runs through him. They went south, and the first thing they did was start stealing, which must have been an interesting moment for a crew who thought they were going to Egypt for currants. Off the coast of Morocco they lost a man, a young sailor who went ashore and was seized. Then, near the Cape Verde Islands, they took a series of Spanish fishing boats and Portuguese vessels. Drake swapped the Little Benedict for a captured Spanish ship and renamed her the Christopher. And then they took a Portuguese merchantman called the Santa Maria, carrying wine and cloth and provisions and, far more valuable than any of it, her pilot. His name was Nuno da Silva. He was Portuguese, experienced, and he knew the coast of Brazil, which no Englishman on board did. Drake kept him, not as a passenger, as a prisoner who was going to navigate for them. Da Silva was aboard that ship for the next 15 months. He saw everything. And he matters enormously to this story for a reason that will not be obvious until much later, so hold his name. Doughty was put in command of the captured Portuguese prize, and this is where it starts. Within days, an accusation reached Drake that Doughty had taken items from the prize cargo for himself. Gloves, coins, a ring, small things. Drake, who had taken items from the same cargo himself, treated it as theft and as a challenge. Doughty was removed from that command, then shuffled again, and finally put down on the little supply ship, the Swan. That was not a reassignment. That was the public humiliation of a gentleman in front of 160 men, and everybody on all 5 ships understood it that way. And then they crossed the Atlantic. 63 days without sight of land. 2 months of the same horizon in every direction, on ships where 2 factions were now openly hostile, and the commander had begun believing something extraordinary about one of them, because the Swan got separated from the fleet in a storm. And Drake decided that Doughty had done it with witchcraft. Witchcraft in Elizabethan England was a criminal offence with a statute attached to it. Courts convicted people of it and executed them for it. And Drake was a hardline Protestant sailing in a period where God's favour was understood as an active daily force in whether your ship survived. When storms scattered a fleet, why was a religious question as much as a meteorological one? So Drake accusing Doughty of conjuring was not Drake going mad. It was Drake reaching for the most destructive weapon his own culture made available to him. He called Doughty a conjurer and a seditious person. He called Doughty's brother John a witch and a poisoner. On the 17th of May, 1578, the fleet came back together, and Drake and Doughty had a final confrontation. Drake struck him and had him tied to the mast. By the 3rd of June, both Doughty brothers were under arrest, and the crew were forbidden to speak to them, and the fleet went on south into colder and colder water, with 2 prisoners aboard and 160 men who still had not been told where they were going, watching their commander turn on the best connected man on the expedition. On the 20th of June, 1578, they came into a bay on the coast of Patagonia, a wide, bleak, wind-scoured harbour with almost nothing growing on it. Port St. Julian. And when they went ashore, they found something already standing there. A gibbet, a wooden gallows, weathered, half-rotted, still upright on the beach. It had been put there 58 years earlier by Ferdinand Magellan, who had wintered in that exact bay, faced a mutiny by 3 of his own captains, and executed the ringleader on that spot. They were standing on the only place in the Western Hemisphere where a European commander had ever executed his own officers for mutiny, and within 2 weeks it would have happened there twice. Drake convened a court on the beach. He empanelled a jury of 40 men from the crew. He laid out charges. that Doughty had plotted to overthrow the Voyage, that he had spoken words designed to set the company against each other, that he had practiced conjuring. And Doughty, who was a lawyer, immediately went for the one weak point in the whole proceeding. He asked to see Drake's commission. It is a simple question, and it is the right one. Under what authority is this court sitting? A captain in 1578 had disciplinary powers, but the power to try a gentleman for a capital offence on a beach thousands of kilometres from England was not something anybody could simply assume. Doughty wanted to see the paper from the Queen that said Drake could do this. Drake said the commission was in his cabin. He did not produce it. Not then, not later. There is no evidence any such document existed. And when another lawyer aboard, a friend of Doughty's named Leonard Vicary, pointed out that without a visible commission, the trial had no legal standing at all, the reply Drake gave came down to us, and it is worth hearing exactly as it stands. He said he had nothing to do with crafty lawyers, that he did not care for the law, and that he knew what he would do. The jury convicted Doughty. Depending on which account you read, they convicted him only of mutiny, not treason, and several of them clearly believed they were voting under pressure. Drake pronounced the sentence anyway, death. And then something happened that is one of the strangest scenes in the whole of this voyage, and that nobody has ever fully explained. Drake and Doughty spent the last evening together. They took communion side by side from the ship's chaplain, Francis Fletcher. Then they dined at the same table, and Fletcher, who was there and wrote it down, described the two of them eating together as cheerfully and as calmly as they ever had in their lives, each encouraging the other and drinking to one another at the end of it as if one of them were merely going on a journey. Then, on the 2nd of July 1578, Thomas Doughty knelt on the sand at Port St. Julian and was beheaded. Drake picked up the head, held it up in front of the assembled crews and said, "This is the end of traitors. Now I have to be careful, because what follows is a live historical argument and not a settled thing I can hand you." Was Doughty guilty? There were real witnesses. Crew members testified that Doughty had talked about making the company cut one another's throats. There is testimony that he tried to buy a carpenter's loyalty. He was ambitious, well-connected, and may genuinely have believed he had a claim to co-command, and in an expedition where the commander's authority was the only thing holding 160 frightened men together, a rival power centre was lethal. And the counter-reading is just as available. That Drake needed a rival gone before the hard part began and used a trial to do it. That the witchcraft charge is the tell. It is what you reach for when the real charges are not enough. That a man who actually held royal authority to execute would simply have produced the paper. When Drake got home, John Doughty tried to bring a private prosecution against him for murder. He got nowhere and was shortly afterwards imprisoned, and what happened to him after that is thin to the point of vanishing. Nobody has settled it. It is still being argued in print 448 years later, and there is one detail here that ought to raise the hair on your arms, given how tonight opened. The full records of the Doughty trial, the depositions, the jury's verdict, the proceedings, were among the papers that went into the Queen's custody in 1580 and were never seen again. Everything we know about that beach comes from private accounts written by men who were there and who wrote them down anyway, in defiance of an order, and hid them. Hold that. It is going to matter more than once tonight. And then Drake did something on that beach which is, in its way, more consequential than the execution. He called the entire company together, every man from every ship, and gave them a speech. And the substance of it was this: the old division ends here. There will be no more gentlemen and no more sailors. He said he must have the gentleman haul and draw with the mariner, and the mariner with the gentleman, and he said he wanted to see the man among them who would refuse to put his hand to a rope. Then he did something even more direct. He dismissed every officer in the fleet from their post, on the spot, and then reappointed them, from himself, by his own authority. Which meant that from that morning, no man on that expedition held his position because of a patron in London. They held it because Drake gave it to them, and he could take it back. You can read that speech two ways: as a radical piece of leadership, flattening a rigid class hierarchy on a small ship, because on a small ship it will kill you, or as the last consolidating move of a man who has just executed his rival and is rebuilding the whole command structure around himself. It is probably both, and it worked. From Port St. Julian onward, for the next 26 months, there is not one recorded challenge to Drake's authority. Not one. He had paid an extraordinary price for it, but he had it. They wintered in that bay for 2 months, then broke up 2 of the ships for firewood and salvage and moved everyone onto 3. The Golden Hind, the Elizabeth, the Marigold, 3 ships now. And on the 20th of August 1578, as they came up to the entrance of the Strait of Magellan, Drake renamed his flagship. The Pelican became the Golden Hind. A golden hind, a female red deer, was the crest of Sir Christopher Hatton, who was the patron and employer of the man Drake had just beheaded on the beach. There is no record of Drake explaining why. Most historians read it exactly the way you just did, as a very expensive apology sent home in advance from a man who understood that when he got back to England, he was going to have to explain Thomas Doughty to Thomas Doughty's employer. He was naming his ship after the crest of the man he most needed not to hang him, and then he sailed it into the strait. The Strait of Magellan is not a channel in any useful sense of the word. It is a 570-kilometre maze. It cuts between the southern tip of mainland South America and the islands of Tierra del Fuego, and it is one of the least forgiving pieces of navigable water on the planet. It narrows to a couple of kilometres, it bends, it branches into dead ends that look exactly like the way through. The mountains rise straight out of the water, which means the wind does not blow along it. It falls into it, in sudden vertical blasts off the peaks that can knock a ship over. The water is deep right up to the rock, so there is often nowhere to anchor, and the weather changes in minutes. Magellan, going through it first with no chart at all, took 38 days and lost a ship to desertion. Drake took 16. That is the most underrated fact of this whole voyage, and it was not luck. Drake rowed ahead. He personally took a small boat out in front of the fleet, into the channels, to find the passage and come back and lead the ships through. He did that repeatedly. He used the tides, he used every hour of daylight, and he moved with an aggression that no sane navigator would have used in unknown water, except that he'd spent his childhood in the tidal creeks and sandbanks of the Thames estuary and the Channel, and there is no better school on earth for reading a difficult, shifting, shallow, dangerous piece of water at speed. The kind of sailing he had learned as a poor boy running cargo up the coast turned out to be exactly the skill set for the Strait of Magellan. They came out the other side on the 6th of September 1578, into the ocean Drake had climbed a tree to look at 6 years before. The first English ship ever to reach it, and then that ocean tried to kill them for 52 days. The storm that hit them on the 7th of September is one of the worst recorded weather events in the history of European exploration, and it did not stop. It drove them south, not along the coast, but away from it, into open water, in entirely the wrong direction. It blew for days, then weeks, and went on blowing. Fletcher wrote of seas arriving from directions that made no sense, of a sky that never cleared, of men who had lost the ability to tell one day from the next. On the 30th of September, the Marigold disappeared. 30 tons, 29 men aboard. She was there, and then she was not, and no wreckage was ever found, and no survivor ever surfaced anywhere in the world. Fletcher recorded something else about that night, and I give it to you as what he wrote rather than as fact, because there is no way to test it. He wrote that he and others on watch heard cries coming across the water in the dark, and believed they were hearing the men of the Marigold going down. Whether that was real or the sound of the sea on a night when everyone was half dead with exhaustion and terror, nobody can say. But somebody wrote it down at the time, and it has been in the record for 448 years. 29 men. No grave, no wreck, no explanation beyond the weather. A week later, the Elizabeth got separated from the Golden Hind in the dark. Her captain, John Winter, found his way back to the mouth of the strait and sheltered. He waited, and then his crew, battered, frightened, and now convinced the flagship was gone too, refused to go on. Winter took the Elizabeth back through the strait the other way, which had never been done before by an English ship, and sailed home. He reached England in June 1579, more than a year before Drake did, and he reported that the expedition was in all likelihood destroyed, which is why, 27 months later, half of Plymouth did not recognise the ship coming into the Sound. Now look at where Drake actually is. 5 ships left England. 2 were broken up for firewood. 1 went home. 1 is at the bottom of the Pacific with everyone aboard. He is alone. 1 ship somewhere south of the bottom of South America, in an ocean no Englishman has ever sailed, with no support vessel, no possibility of rescue, no way to send a message, and a hold full of nothing. And the storm is still blowing. But the storm did something else as well, and it is the moment on this voyage that rewrote the world's maps. Every European geographer in 1578 believed that Tierra del Fuego was not an island group. They believed it was the northern edge of an enormous undiscovered southern continent wrapping around the bottom of the world. It was called Terra Australis Incognita, and it appeared on virtually every serious world map of the century as solid coastline. That belief was why the Strait of Magellan mattered so much. If a continent was down there, the strait was the only door between the Atlantic and the Pacific in the entire southern hemisphere. Whoever held the strait held the ocean, and Spain understood that perfectly, which is exactly why Spain felt safe. The storm blew Drake south past where that continent was supposed to be, and there was no continent. There was open water, rough, cold, enormous, and open, running clean around the bottom of South America and away into the Southern Ocean. Drake had accidentally proved that Spain's door was not the only door, that you did not need the strait at all, that the Pacific had a wide open southern approach, and Spain could not lock it. That body of water is on your map tonight. It is called the Drake Passage. Every ship that goes to Antarctica crosses it. Every account of the roughest seas on Earth begins with it. He found it by being nearly killed in it. And while he was down there, sheltering in the lee of some land for a few days, Drake recorded and named an island. He called it Elizabeth Island for the Queen, and it went onto the charts. Here is the strange part. Nobody has ever found it again. For more than 170 years, European maps showed an island in that area, sometimes labelled as a port discovered by Sir Francis Drake. Then, gradually, as the Southern Ocean was properly surveyed, it stopped appearing, because at the coordinates that come down to us there is no land. There is very deep water, well west of Cape Horn, where nothing has ever been charted. There are explanations, all plausible, none proven, that his latitude was simply wrong, which in that storm it easily could have been, that he sheltered at one of the small islands south of Tierra del Fuego and misplaced it, or, and this is the version that keeps a certain kind of person up at night, that it was misplaced on purpose, that the positions from this voyage were quietly wrong when they were finally published, because the Queen did not want anyone navigating by them. Set that beside the fact that we're already dealing with a voyage whose charts were seized by a government. I am not telling you that is the answer. I am telling you that a place sat on the maps of Europe for the better part of 2 centuries because Francis Drake said it was there, and no one since has been able to find it. That is one open loop. We will collect more. Eventually the weather broke, and Drake, alone, turned the Golden Hind north, into the richest, most complacent, most completely undefended coastline on the face of the earth. You need to understand how safe the Spanish felt, or none of what follows will land properly. In 1493, the year after Columbus came back, the Pope had drawn a line down the Atlantic and divided the unexplored world between Spain and Portugal. The following year, the 2 crowns adjusted it themselves in the Treaty of Tordesillas. Everything west of the line was Spain's, everything east was Portugal's. By 1578, that division had hardened into something the Spanish treated as physical fact. The Pacific was mare clausum, a closed sea, not a metaphor, a legal doctrine. The Pacific was Spanish property, and the only way in was the Strait of Magellan, and the strait sat a full half-planet away from any English port. And 50 years of absolute security built exactly what you would expect. Towns with no walls, ports with no forts, ships that carried treasure with almost no guns, because there was no one to defend against. Silver bars stacked on quaysides overnight, because who exactly is going to take them? A whole coastline from Chile to Panama, running on the assumption that no hostile ship could physically get there. And then one did. The first contact was not a robbery, and it went badly, and it tells you something about Drake. At the island of Mocha, off Chile, in late November 1578, the Golden Hind sent a boat ashore for water. The people living there had been driven onto that island by the Spanish and had been fighting them for decades. They saw a European boat coming in and did the obvious thing. They ambushed it. 2 Englishmen were killed. Drake himself was hit. An arrow in the face close to the eye and another in the scalp. His men wanted to go back with guns. He refused. He said the islanders had made an honest mistake, that taking the English for Spaniards was entirely reasonable, and that he did not want the English name to mean in the Pacific what the Spanish name already meant. Whether that was principle or calculation, or a man with an arrow wound in his face deciding a fight was not worth it, you can weigh for yourself. He did not go back, and 2 of his men stayed dead on that beach. They sailed north. And on the 5th of December 1578, they came into the harbour at Valparaiso, on the coast of Chile. There was a ship at anchor there called La Capitana. Her crew saw sails coming in, and they were pleased. Ships were rare and welcome on that coast. So they did what you do when friends arrive. They beat a drum in greeting and got the wine out. The Golden Hind came alongside, and English sailors came over the rail, and one of them punched a Spanish sailor in the face and told him, in Spanish, to shut up. That is the moment the Pacific stopped being safe. And now the news began moving up the coast, slowly on horseback, over hundreds of kilometres, arriving days or weeks late everywhere it went. Drake was travelling faster than the warnings about him. At Tarapacar, by one account, a landing party found a Spaniard asleep on the shore beside 13 bars of silver, took the silver, and left the man sleeping. A little further on, they met a man walking 8 llamas down to the coast, each carrying about 50 pounds of refined silver. They took the llamas too. At Arica, more. At every stop, a little more. And then, in February 1579, he went into Callao, the port of Lima, and the most important harbour on the Spanish Pacific coast. Not at night, not by stealth. He sailed straight in among about 30 anchored Spanish ships and dropped anchor in the middle of them, and nobody challenged him, because an enemy warship in Callao harbour was not a thing that existed in anybody's head. His men went from vessel to vessel by boat, cutting anchor cables so nothing could follow, and took what they found, which was less than he had hoped, because a treasure shipment had already gone. But in Callao he picked up something worth far more than anything in those holds. A ship had sailed north, not long before, for Panama. She was carrying the accumulated silver of the season. She was a big galleon, well known on the coast, and her name was Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, although nobody actually called her that. Her own crew called her something else, a nickname that has followed her into every history book since, and it translates roughly, and I will keep this decent, as the fire thrower, the Cacafuego. She had a 2-week head start. Drake cut his anchor cable and went after her. The chase up the coast of Peru and Ecuador took nearly 2 weeks, and he ran it on interrogation. Every ship he overhauled, he stopped, boarded, robbed, and questioned. Where is the Cacafuego? How long since she passed? What is she carrying? Each time the gap closed a little, and each time the numbers got larger, and he put a price on her, a gold chain to the first man who sighted her. The man who won it was his own young cousin, John Drake, up in the crow's nest on the afternoon of the 1st of March 1579, off Cape San Francisco on the Ecuadorian coast. Sail on the horizon. Her captain was a Basque named San Juan de Anton. He watched the ship behind him all afternoon, decided she was a Spanish vessel out of Chile, and was mildly curious about why she was catching him at all. And here is where you see the mind of a man who has been planning this for years. Drake did not attack. He looked at the sun and worked out that at his current speed he would come up on the galleon in full afternoon light, and that a strange ship closing at speed in open water gives the other captain time to run, or to arm, or to throw the treasure over the side. So he slowed his ship down. He had wine jars filled with water and slung over the stern on ropes, dragging in the sea, and he trimmed his sails to look sluggish and merchant-like. For hours the Golden Hind wallowed along behind the Cacafuego, looking exactly like a fat slow trader going the same way, until the light started to go. At dusk, Drake cut the jars loose. The Golden Hind came out from behind that disguise, moving at her real speed, and closed the last of the gap, and Anton heard a voice across the water in the dark ordering him to strike his sails in the name of the Queen of England. Anton's reply is recorded, and it is magnificent, and it is the last free thing he ever said. He told them to come and do it themselves if they thought they were men enough. They fired one volley. A cannon shot took down his mizzen mast. Arrows came across, and then the boarding party was over the rail, and it was finished in minutes with almost nobody hurt. Then they opened the hold. It took 6 days to move the cargo of that one ship into the Golden Hind, working with boats and tackle in the open sea, and even after 6 days there is reason to think they did not get all of it. Here is what the records describe: 13 chests of silver coin, 80 pounds of gold, a crucifix of gold set with emeralds, 26 tons of silver in bars and ingots, jewels, plate, porcelain, 26 tons. Say that number slowly. That is the weight of a loaded articulated lorry, in silver, being lifted piece by piece out of one wooden ship and into another wooden ship in the swell of the open Pacific by men working ropes with their hands. It was, by a distance, the largest single seizure of treasure in the history of the sea to that date. And then Drake did something that has puzzled people for 4 centuries. He kept San Juan de Anton aboard as a guest for several days and treated him with extraordinary courtesy. He dined with him. He showed him around the Golden Hind, the guns, the fittings, his own cabin, which was reportedly furnished better than most houses. He gave gifts to the officers and passengers appropriate to their rank. He gave Anton a German firearm and a silver bowl. He wrote him a letter of safe conduct addressed to any English ship that might stop him, guaranteeing he would not be harmed, and then he let him go. Read one way, that is an oddly honourable man observing the courtesies of war. Read another way, it is about as effective a piece of self-presentation as anybody ever performed. Drake knew exactly what came next. Anton would reach Panama and be questioned at length, under oath, by Spanish officials who needed to understand this catastrophe. And what Anton would tell them was not that he had been robbed by a pirate. It was that he had been robbed by an officer of the Queen of England who behaved like a gentleman and kept an orderly ship. Drake was managing the story from the deck of the ship he had just emptied. And notice what that produces, because it is genuinely strange. Those Spanish depositions survive. Anton's testimony, other captured captains, and later the very long interrogation of Nuno da Silva, the Portuguese pilot, whom Drake eventually released straight into Spanish hands. England confiscated and buried its own records of this voyage. Spain, trying to work out what had been done to it, wrote everything down and filed it. A great deal of what we know tonight, we know because his victims were debriefed, which is also exactly why the gap that is coming is a gap. And one more thing is happening on that deck that nobody aboard thinks about twice. Drake is keeping a log, a good one, an illustrated one, with the coastlines painted in, which men who saw it later described. Every position, every landfall, every anchorage of this entire voyage is going into it, in his own hand, day by day. He has no idea he's writing something that will be taken off him. Da Silva was released on the 15th of April 1579 at a small port called Guatulco on the Mexican coast, which Drake robbed on his way past, the last Spanish town he would touch on this voyage. From that moment, there is no Spanish witness aboard the Golden Hind, and from that moment, the record of where the ship went becomes an argument. Put yourself on that deck in April 1579, because the problem is a genuinely hard one. You have just committed the largest robbery in the history of the ocean. You're in a ship that is now dangerously heavy on a hostile coast, with 50-something men, and every Spanish authority from Chile to Mexico now knows you exist and knows roughly where you are. You have to get this home, and there are only 3 ways out of the Pacific. Option 1, back the way you came, south through the Strait of Magellan. It is the route you know. It is also the route every Spanish official on the continent will assume you are taking, and the Viceroy of Peru has already sent ships after you. The strait is a 500-kilometre corridor with no exits. If they are waiting at the far end, you die in it. Option 2, west, straight out into the Pacific across an ocean no Englishman has seen so much as a chart of. Magellan's men did that and it nearly annihilated them. And option 3, which is the reason the rest of tonight exists. Go north. Because everybody in Europe in 1579 believed there was a passage across the top of North America. Not hoped, believed. It appeared on maps as a real feature, and the Spanish had a name for it, the Strait of Anian. Cartographers drew it confidently with coastlines and headlands, because the logic seemed sound. There was a passage at the bottom of South America. The world was assumed to be roughly symmetrical, therefore there was one at the top. Nobody had found it. That was assumed to be a matter of not having looked properly, and England was obsessed with it, for reasons of pure commercial arithmetic. The southern route was Spanish, the African route was Portuguese. If a northern passage existed, it was the only door to Asia not already owned, and it was on England's side of the world. Martin Frobisher had already made 3 voyages hunting the Atlantic end of it. John Dee, the man in the background of Drake's briefing in London, had been arguing for years that England had a claim to the north of America. So here is the possibility that has occupied a certain class of historian for the last century. That option 3 was not an improvisation. That going north was in the plan from the start. That the actual, unwritten, deniable purpose of this voyage was not just to rob Spain. It was to come at the Northwest Passage from the wrong end. To find the Pacific mouth of it, which nobody had ever attempted, and sail home through the top of the world with the secret in the hold along with the silver. Drake turned the Golden Hind north from the coast of Mexico in April 1579, and now notice what happens to this story. Up to this point, every stage of the voyage has been anchored by outside witnesses, Spanish depositions, Portuguese testimony, robbed captains with dates and positions. From here, there are no outside witnesses at all. There is nothing but English accounts, all of them written or published after the Queen's silence order, several of them anonymously, and they do not agree. We're about to walk into the hole. Here is what is not disputed. Between April and July of 1579, the Golden Hind sailed north along the west coast of North America, further than any European ship had ever been. She encountered severe cold. She found a harbour, careened and repaired, spent roughly 5 weeks ashore among a people the English had never seen before, claimed the land for Elizabeth, and then turned west into the Pacific on the 23rd of July. That is the agreed skeleton. Everything else is disputed. The accounts describe conditions that are genuinely difficult to explain. They talk about extreme biting cold in the month of June. They describe rope stiffening. They describe meat freezing the moment it came off the fire. They describe fog so thick and persistent that the crew could not see and could not get a sun sight and could not fix a position. Fletcher, the chaplain, wrote of the men suffering badly, of the sea being covered in a vile, thick, stinking fog for days at a time. Read that against the geography. In June, on the coast of Northern California, you get fog. That is real. That coast is famous for it. But you do not get meat freezing as it leaves the fire. You get that a very long way further north. And then there are the latitudes. The accounts published in England give different numbers for how far north Drake actually got. One says he reached 42 degrees. One says 48. There is a reading that puts it at 50. The earliest published version of this voyage and the fuller version published decades later do not match each other. The difference between 42 degrees and 50 degrees is roughly 900 kilometers of coastline. That is not a rounding error. That is the difference between the Oregon border and the north end of Vancouver Island. Now, Why would the numbers disagree? The dull answer: because they were written by different men from memory years apart without the log, since the log had been confiscated. That is a completely sufficient explanation, and plenty of serious historians hold it. The other answer: because somebody made them disagree, because look at what else was happening. Within a few years of Drake's return, world maps began appearing in Europe carrying Pacific detail no cartographer should have had. Ortelius updated his work. A Hondius map published in the 1590s shows Drake's track and an inset of his harbour on the North American coast. Information was leaking in pieces out of a voyage that was officially secret. So the reconstruction, some historians argue, most prominently the Canadian researcher Samuel Balfe, in a book that has been fought over ever since, runs like this: that Drake sailed far further north than the published accounts admit, that he was hunting the western mouth of the Northwest Passage, working up through the coastal islands of what is now British Columbia and possibly into southern Alaska, that he found something worth making a state secret of, and that the Crown then published a shortened northern voyage with the latitudes pulled southward, so Spain would never understand what England had. I want to be completely straight about where that argument stands. It is not the mainstream position. Most academic historians put the landing in Northern California, near Point Reyes, and think the far north case reads too much into the maps. There are careful rebuttals. Balfe's argument depends on reading cartographic evidence in a way not everybody accepts, and on assuming a level of deliberate falsification that is possible but unproven. It is also not a crank theory. People have spent careers responding to it, so where does that leave us tonight? It leaves us here. In the summer of 1579, an English ship went further up the Pacific coast of North America than any European vessel in history, and the only records of it were seized by a government that had an obvious motive to alter them, and the surviving versions contradict each other by 900 kilometres. There is no wreck. There is no artefact anyone has authenticated. There is no log in Drake's hand, and Drake kept one, an illustrated one with coastlines painted into it, because contemporaries described seeing it. It went to the Queen. It has never been found. Nobody alive knows how far North Francis Drake got. Let that sit for a second, because we're about to go ashore, and we're going ashore into the one part of this that we can actually see. On the 17th of June, 1579, the Golden Hind came into a sheltered bay. Wherever it was what Drake urgently needed. His ship had been in the water since December the 1577, with no proper overhaul, and she was leaking. Below the waterline, the timbers were being eaten by shipworm, which bores into wood and can hollow a hull from the inside until it fails without warning. And she was carrying 26 tons of silver, which meant she rode low and worked hard in every sea. He had to careen her into shallow water, unload everything, haul her over onto her side with tackle, scrape and repair the exposed hull, then turn her and do the other side. It takes weeks, and while you do it, your ship is lying on a beach, and you are completely defenseless. They were there for 5 weeks, and they were not alone. The people whose land it was came down to look at them, and the English understood almost nothing of what followed, and were certain they understood all of it. The English described being met with what they took for reverence, and gifts of feathers and tobacco. They described ceremonies involving loud crying and self-wounding, which Fletcher wrote they tried to stop and could not. And they described a man they took for a king placing a feathered crown on Drake's head, which the English recorded formally and in writing as the voluntary submission of the country and its people to the Queen of England. Almost none of that is likely to be what happened. If the landing was in Northern California, These were most probably Coast Miwok people, and much of what the English saw maps onto known Miwok mourning practice. Loud vocal grief and self-inflicted wounding were part of how death was ritually marked, which points somewhere far darker and more human than a coronation. That these people did not think they were greeting kings. There is a reasonable case they believed they were dealing with the dead, returned ancestors or spirits, and were performing the correct rites for that. If that is right, the founding ceremony of the English claim to North America was a funeral, and the English wrote it up as a transfer of sovereignty. Nobody can prove that reading. What can be said is that the only account of that beach was written by men who spoke none of the language, had been at sea for 18 months, and had a powerful interest in reporting that a country had just been handed to their queen. Two people stood on the same sand for 5 weeks, and each walked away with a completely wrong idea of what had happened. The English named the place Nova Albion, New England, Albion being the old poetic name for Britain, and Fletcher explained the choice by pointing at white cliffs along the shore that reminded them of home. And before they left, they set up a post with a plate of metal nailed to it, engraved with the Queen's name and the date and a claim to the whole country, with a sixpence bearing Elizabeth's portrait fixed into it. Then, on the 23rd of July 1579, they sailed west and left the plate standing on the shore. Remember that plate, because in 1936 somebody found it. In 1936, a man came across a piece of brass near San Francisco Bay. It was engraved. It carried Elizabeth's name, a claim of possession, the date the 17th of June 1579, and a hole where a coin had been. It reached Herbert Bolton, professor at Berkeley, and one of the most respected historians in the United States, a man who'd been telling his students for years to watch out for exactly this object. He authenticated it and announced it. It was a sensation. Front pages across America. Physical proof of the first English claim on the Pacific coast, the founding document of English North America. It turned Bolton into a national figure. The plate went on display. Replicas were produced. It went into textbooks, and generations of American schoolchildren learned about Drake's plate of brass. It was fake. Bolton had authenticated it before proper metallurgical testing. When the plate finally went through serious laboratory analysis in the 1970s, the results were conclusive. The brass had been made by a process that did not exist in the 16th century. The zinc was wrong. The rolling was modern. In 1977, it was publicly declared a forgery, and in 2003, researchers published the last piece. It had been a joke. Bolton's own friends and colleagues, members of a historical society he belonged to, had made the plate as a prank, meaning to reveal it and enjoy his reaction. There was reportedly a hidden marking on it meant to give the game away. He did not spot it. He announced it to the world. And the moment it became a national news story, the men who made it understood that owning up would destroy the career of somebody they respected. So they said nothing. For 40 years. Now take the practical consequence, because it is why this is not simply an amusing story. Strip out the plate, and the physical evidence for where Francis Drake landed in North America is zero. No confirmed artifact, no confirmed site, nothing. There is a plaque at Point Reyes marking it as the likely place. The National Park Service is careful to describe it as possible. 447 years, and we have a hole in the record where the log should be, a national forgery where the monument should be, and a landing site that is a best guess. That is the state of the evidence. Now let us get the ship home. he went west on the 23rd of July 1579 into 9,000 miles of open Pacific and did not see land for 68 days. Magellan's crossing took 98 and reduced his men to eating leather while 19 of them died. Drake's was faster, and his crew came through it in reasonable condition, which was not luck either. 5 weeks ashore on fresh food, a hull that had just been fully overhauled, a crew reduced by attrition to a number the stores could feed comfortably, and a commander who had spent 18 months restocking off other people's ships. On the 16th of October they raised the Philippines. On the 3rd of November they reached the Moluccas, the small volcanic cluster in modern Indonesia, which was, at that moment, the only source of cloves on Earth. 2 fishing canoes guided them in through the islands to Ternate, under the volcano, and there Drake walked into a reception that was not really about him at all. It was about local politics, which he read instantly and used perfectly. The ruler of Ternate was Sultan Babula, and he had just done something no European power thought possible. He had thrown the Portuguese out. They had held a fortress on his island and dominated the clove trade for decades, and he had besieged them, broken them, and driven them off. So a European ship arrived, and its captain announced he was an enemy of Portugal. Babula sent canoes to tow the Golden Hind to a safe anchorage, and came out to meet her in state. Drake had his musicians play. He carried musicians on a ship that size on that voyage, and the accounts describe the Golden Hind towing the Sultan's own boat, while the music carried across the water. Babula fed them properly for the first time in months, and offered England trading rights in cloves. They took on 6 tons, which looks small beside the silver and is not. An English ship had just reached the source of the spice trade and been offered a deal, with neither Portugal nor Spain in the middle. The commercial logic of the next 2 centuries of English expansion into Asia starts, quietly, at that anchorage, and every night of that crossing in the cabin the log was being kept. The northern coast was in it, the latitudes were in it, the bay was in it, with the shape of the headland drawn. It had about 9 months left to exist. Then, on the 9th of January 1580, at 8 in the evening, with a full moon and a fair wind and every sail set, the Golden Hind ran onto a reef. She hit hard and stuck fast. Their situation was about as bad as it gets. They dropped a line on the seaward side to find bottom so they could kedge off, run an anchor out and haul the ship backwards to it, and the lead went down and found nothing. The reef fell straight into deep water on the wrong side. There was nothing to anchor to. A wooden ship on a coral shelf in the dark holding 26 tons of silver, thousands of kilometres from any friendly port, with no other vessel within half a world, and no way to pull herself off. If she broke up there, that was the end of all of it. 50-odd men on a reef in the Celebes Sea, and the greatest voyage in English history becomes a rumour that stops in the dark. They were on that reef for 20 hours. Fletcher preached. They took communion. Then Drake put them to work throwing the ship overboard to lighten her. 8 cannon went into the sea. 8 of the guns that were the only thing keeping the ship safe. 3 tons of cloves went over, which is to say, a fortune, freshly acquired, dropped into the water. Provisions went, stores went. Notice what did not go over the Ide. Not 1 bar of the silver. At some point on the 10th of January, the wind that had been pinning her onto the coral changed direction. The Golden Hind heeled, slid off into deep water and floated. As far as anyone could tell, undamaged. There is a coda to that day, and it is about the least attractive thing in the whole record. In the aftermath, Francis Fletcher, the chaplain, the man who had preached to them on the reef, the man whose private account is the single richest surviving source for this voyage, said or wrote something suggesting that the grounding had been a judgment from God for the killing of Thomas Doughty. Drake found out. He had Fletcher chained to a hatch cover. He then conducted a ceremony in which he personally excommunicated the ship's chaplain, which is not a thing a sea captain has any authority whatsoever to do, and had a sign hung on him naming him the falsest knave living. 19 months after that beach in Patagonia, Doughty was still on that ship, and the man who wrote down more of what we know about this voyage than anybody else was a man Drake humiliated in front of the crew. They worked south through the islands, stopped in Java in March 1580, and then ran for home, across the Indian Ocean, round the Cape of Good Hope, and north up the whole length of Africa without stopping once. Every port on that route was Portuguese or Spanish, and a ship carrying 26 tons of stolen silver cannot risk a harbour. From Java to Sierra Leone, they did not touch land. When they finally came in for water on the 22nd of July 1580, they'd been at sea continuously for close to 4 months. And then, on the 26th of September 1580, the Golden Hind came into Plymouth Sound. Drake did not go ashore. He saw fishing boats on the water, and he called across to them, and the question he asked before he would land is the most revealing thing he ever said. Was the Queen alive and well? Everything he had done for 3 years, the executions, the raids, the theft, the flag on the beach in North America, rested on one person. If Elizabeth was dead, then her Catholic cousin or Spanish pressure or court faction was in charge, and Francis Drake was not a returning hero. He was a pirate with a hold full of evidence, and there was a very specific gibbet at low water mark waiting for men like him. He would not set foot on English soil until he knew. They told him she was alive, and that there was plague in Plymouth. He came in. What followed was 6 months of delicate political theatre. The Spanish ambassador, Bernardino de Mendoza, demanded the treasure back and demanded Drake punished. And legally he was right. Everything in that hold had been taken from Spanish subjects during peacetime. Elizabeth stalled. The treasure was landed and moved to the Tower of London and an inventory taken. But before that inventory, Drake was allowed to remove a quantity of it that was never counted. The Queen, according to the accounts, told him to keep a sum back for himself and said she did not wish to be told how much. And then, on the 4th of April 1581, she went down to Deptford on the Thames, where the Golden Hind was moored, and dined on board, and she knighted him. But look at how she did it, because the method was among the most calculated gestures of her whole reign. She did not perform the knighting herself. She handed the sword to the French ambassador, the Seigneur de Marchaumont, and had him do it. France was Spain's rival. Elizabeth was, at that moment, negotiating a possible French marriage. By putting the sword in a French hand, she made the honouring of Francis Drake a joint Anglo-French act, a public statement to Philip of Spain that if he wanted to make an issue of this, he would be making an issue of it with 2 countries. She was using a knighthood as a diplomatic weapon, on the deck of a stolen fortune, in front of the ambassador of the country she had stolen it from. Philip of Spain never got the silver back. The Golden Hind was kept at Deptford as a public monument, and became one of the sights of London, and people came to see her for decades while she rotted, until after about 70 years there was nothing left worth keeping, and she was broken up. A chair was made from her last sound timbers. It is at Oxford. That is what is left of the ship, a chair. Now back to the thing we started with. The order came down and it was absolute. Every account of the voyage became, in the phrasing that has reached us, a secret of the realm. charts, logs, journals, drawings, surrendered. Every man aboard sworn to silence on pain of death, and it held. That is the astonishing part. For a very long time it actually held. The first substantial English account came out anonymously years later, and it is short, a summary with the northern section thin and the positions vague. The fullest version, the one nearly everybody has read ever since, was not published until 1628. 48 years after the ship came home, Drake had been dead for 32 of them, Elizabeth for 25. The compiler was Drake's nephew, assembling a voyage he had never been on out of Fletcher's notes and whatever papers had survived a confiscation. That is the document almost everything you have ever read about this voyage descends from, and the silence worked so well that it damaged England. Because whatever Drake found on that northern coast, England never used it. No follow-up expedition, no colony. Nova Albion sat in the paperwork, waved at occasionally in legal arguments about English rights in America, and nothing was built on it. 200 years later, when English ships finally came back to the coastline, Cook in the 1770s, Vancouver in the 1790s, they were charting it as unknown water. Vancouver was mapping those islands from scratch. If Drake had been there, nobody in England could prove it because the proof was in a box and by then nobody could find the box. A government kept a secret so well that it kept it from itself. And what did the voyage do? It made England financially. The Queen's share cleared the national debt and seeded the Levant Company. And there is a well-known argument, Keynes made a version of it, that the returns from Drake's plunder run straight into the origins of English overseas investment, and from there into the East India Company. It made England psychologically. Before 1580, Spain was simply too big to fight. After 1580, one Devon sailor in a 100-ton ship had taken Spain's private ocean apart and come home rich. 8 years later, when Philip's armada came up the channel, Drake was vice-admiral of the fleet that stopped it, and it did something nobody at the time counted. 164 men left Plymouth. 56 came back on that ship. Not all the difference is dead. Some sailed home with winter, some were left along the way. But the Marigold alone took 29 down in a single night, and there is no list anywhere that gives you more than a handful of their names. They were sailmakers and gunners and ship's boys and cooks, mostly poor, mostly from the West Country, who signed on for a current run to Egypt and ended at the bottom of the world. So who was he? The case for the villain builds itself. He was a thief, and everything in that hold belonged to somebody. He killed a man on a beach in a trial whose authority he could not produce. He sailed on his cousin's slaving voyages and profited from a trade that would consume millions of lives. He claimed a country full of people on the strength of a ceremony he could not understand, and wrote it up as consent. He chained his own chaplain to a hatch, and the case for the other thing builds itself just as fast. A poor boy from a rotting hulk on the Medway became the finest practical seaman of his century. He took a 100-ton ship round the planet and lost her to nothing. Not a reef, not a storm, not scurvy, not mutiny. He refused to retaliate at Mocha with his own men dead and an arrow in his face. He fed and released the prisoners he took, and San Juan de Anton, who had every reason to describe a monster, described a courteous man. He flattened the class system on his own deck at a time when nobody did that. Both descriptions cover the same 3 years and the same man, and every fact in both is documented. Spain called him El Draque and frightened children with his name. England called him the Sea Dog and put him on plates. Neither country was describing the whole person, and neither wanted to. You're not obliged to settle him tonight. Nobody has managed it in 446 years, and there is one man here I keep coming back to, Nuno da Silva, the Portuguese pilot taken off Cape Verde, who navigated 15 months for a captain he had not chosen on a voyage he had not agreed to, who saw the Strait and the storm and the coast of Peru and the Cacafuego, and was then put ashore on a beach in Mexico and walked into Spanish hands, where he was interrogated at length and handed to the Inquisition for having grown too friendly with heretics. He was eventually released, and as far as anyone has established, he made it back across the Atlantic. And then the record simply stops. A great deal of what the world knows about this voyage exists because that man was questioned about it. He is one of the reasons the story survives at all, and nobody can tell you where or when he died. We started tonight on a dock in Plymouth with a ship nobody recognised, and a queen who paid off a country's debts with stolen silver, and then ordered the man who brought it never to say where he had been. We went back 3 years and got on that ship. We watched 164 men sign on for a trip to Egypt. We watched a friendship come apart across the Atlantic and end on a beach in Patagonia, on the same sand where Magellan's gallows was still standing, with a lawyer asking to see a document that was never produced. We watched a man rename his flagship after the crest of the patron of the friend he had just executed, and sail it into a 500-kilometre maze in 16 days. We were blown so far south that a continent everybody believed in turned out not to exist. We came up an undefended coast where the towns had no walls, and dragged wine jars behind us so we would look slow, and took 26 tons of silver out of one ship in 6 days. We turned north, and the record went dark. We came ashore in a bay nobody can locate now, and stood on a beach where two peoples looked at each other, and both of them got it completely wrong, and left a metal plate that the 20th century would forge and believe in for 40 years. We crossed 9,000 miles, sat on a reef for 20 hours throwing our guns into the sea, and came home the long way round the planet with 56 men and a cargo that changed a country. And a few things never closed, and there is no reason to close them now. How far north Drake really went in the summer of 1579, and what was in the log that went to the Queen and never came out again. Whether Thomas Doughty was a traitor or a rival, and what Drake and he actually said to each other over that last dinner, cheerful and calm, drinking to one another the night before. Where Elizabeth Island was, the island Drake charted in the Southern Ocean, which sat on European maps for 170 years, and which no one since has managed to find. Nobody has answered any of those. The Drake Passage is still down there tonight, doing exactly what it was doing when it nearly killed him, and every ship going to Antarctica still has to get across it. The volcano at Ternate is still standing over that anchorage. There is still a bay in Northern California with a plaque calling itself the possible landing place. And in a hall in Oxford there is a chair made out of the last good timber of a ship that went round the world with a fortune in her belly, and a secret she was not allowed to tell. If this carried you to morning, one tap on like does the entire job. That is the only signal I get that people want more of them. Subscribe and you can come on the next voyage, and I will carry on digging out the accounts that survive a hard look, and telling them at this pace in the quiet, as long as there is anybody out there listening. And since this whole thing turned on a man calling across the water to ask what year he had come home to, tell me down below where you are and what your clock says. I genuinely like reading them. Let the logs stay lost. Let the island stay off the charts. 1 ship out of 5 came home with 26 tons of silver and a route nobody was allowed to write down, and the sea it crossed is out there right now. Exactly as wide, exactly as cold, and still not telling. rest easy.